キヤノングローバル戦略研究所研究主幹杉山大志です。本日はですね、トランプのエネルギー政策ということでお話を伺います。で、お話しいただけるのはルシアン・プグリエルシさんで、イタリア系の名前ではアメリカ人もよく発音できないで、みんな単にルーさんってルーですねと呼んでます。で、エネルギーポリシーリサーチファンデーションっていう、その会社の方なんですけど、これもですね EPR エナジーポリシー R でインクでエプリンクっていうふうにですね、みんなこの会社呼んでる、そこの社長さんです。で、これからそのルーに話をしてもらうんですけれども、英語になりますので、最初に私からですねごく簡単に日本語で内容を紹介して、それからルーさんのお話を聞いていただくと。でその後私とルーさんでQ&A セッションをやると、そういう順序で参ります。よろしくお願いします。でこの講演の内容ですけども、トランプ政権のですねエネルギー政策を理解しようということで、キーワードはこのアフォーダブル&リライアブル、手頃な価格で信頼できるエネルギーと、それを確保していこうという話です。でこれがトランプ政権でやろうとしていることですけれども、よく掘って掘って掘りまくれとかドリルベイビードリルとかっていう言葉が報道されてますけど、基本はエネルギーを大量に供給していこうと、それは原子力も化石燃料もですね、バイデン政権の時には化石燃料の使用はCO2 が出るからダメって言ってたんだけど、それはまるで逆のことですね。今度は化石燃料を掘ろうという話になっているということです。で、これは世界の CO2 の排出量ですね、どんどん世界中全体で伸びていますということになります。で、このグラフはですねアメリカの石油のですね生産というのはどんどん増えてきて、で世界の石油需要も増えてきたんだけども、その8割方は実はそのアメリカの増産によって賄われてきたということで、もしこのアメリカの石油の増産というのがなかったらですね、世界の石油価格はもっとずっと高くなっているはずだと、そういうことであります。で、これは今度ガスの方ですね。で、天然ガスの生産量、これもアメリカはものすごく伸びていて、石油もそうなんですけど、このガスもシェールって言って新しい採掘技術なんですけど、今アメリカが世界一の天然ガスの生産量になっていて、世界の 26% になっているというわけです。で、これはですね化石燃料の時代がまだ続いてますよっていう話で、ですね脱炭素って言って化石燃料を使わなくするっていうふうにいう話はずっと出てるんですけども、でも実際のところどうかっていうと、過去30年にわたってですね、化石燃料の世界のエネルギーに占める割合っていうのは6割を超えていると。これ発電に占める化石燃料の割合ですね、6割を超えていると。でそんなに急に減っているというわけではないということです。でこれはアフリカにはですねまだその貧しい国がたくさんあって、でだからその経済開発が必要なんだけど、そのためには電力が必要だろうと、そういうことをお話しするために準備した図です。でこれはですね一人当たりのエネルギー消費量とですね、それから人間開発指数って言いますけど、どのぐらい、大体所得だと思っていいんですけれども、これは比例関係にありますよと。やっぱりエネルギーをたくさん使う国は所得も多くて暮らしぶりも良くなっていると。で貧しい国っていうのはエネルギーもないと。だからエネルギーを増やしてやる、きちんと供給してやるっていうことが経済開発の基本にもなりますということです。で気候変動に関してですね洪水が増えたとか山火事が増えたとかっていう報道はあるんですけど、でも実際統計見るとそうはなっていませんということで、報道されていることと現実には乖離があるということです。で電力需要なんですけども、アメリカはですねかつてはどんどん経済成長とともに電力需要伸びてたんですけども、ここ20年ぐらいはあまり伸びてなかった。でこれが今急増するだろうと予測されていて、年率 3% で伸びるということですね。でこの7年間で 1000テラワットアワー伸びるって、これ大体日本の電力需要全部と同じぐらいのものがこれ今後7年間で伸びると、そういう予測がされている。でこの電力需要が伸びる理由っていうのはAI のために大きなデータセンターが必要になると、いう話が非常に注目されています。でアメリカでですね、過去10年ぐらいどこで電力需要が伸びてきたかっていうのがこの図なんですけども、よく伸びているのがこのバージニア州とそれからテキサス州ですね。で、通信回線が近いところとか、あとそのテキサスの場合はエネルギーが豊富にあって安いということで、多くのその AI 関係の企業がですね、IT 関係の企業がここにどんどん工場を建てて移ってきていると、そういった事情もあるということです。でそのデータセンターとかですね、それからその通信のための電力需要、それからあと暗号通貨ですね、それのマイニングのための電力需要って、こういったものを淘汰すると今もう世界で非常に大きな電力量になっていて、国順に並べるとその国としての電力需要ってこうなるんですけど、実はこの日本が第5位なんですが、もうこのデータセンターなどのですね電力需要だけ、これを世界中で合計するとこの、日本に次ぐぐらいの大きさにすでになっていると。でこれが今後ますます伸びていくだろうということで、電力需要が急増するというふうに言われているわけです。でその電力需要が急増するって話はですね、割と最近言われ始めてきたことで、これは国際機関がやってる予測なんですけど、2021年の予測では2050年の電力需要はここでしたっていうんですけど、毎年これが上方修正されて、2024年にやった予測ではこんなに電力需要が増えますということになっているということです。でこの増えた幅ですね、この大きさっていうのは現在の太陽風力による世界中の発電電力量の3倍にも上るということになっています。でこれがダックカーブっていうんですけど、このカモさんの形になってるっていうんで、カリフォルニアで何が起こってるかということなんですが、アニメーションでやってますけども、電力需要があってですね、で風力発電がこの緑色で、太陽光発電がこの黄色で、この太陽風力に合わせてですね、この青いところを変えなきゃいけないんだけど、これを火力発電でやるんですが、これ火力発電所があるのにここではほとんど止めて、こっちではフル回転してっていうことをしなきゃいけなくて、非常にコストがかかる話になっているということです。でこれが最後のスライドですけども、世界全体でですね、CO2 が成り行きでいくと、2050年までにこのぐらいまで増えるというところを、今先進国 OECD 諸国が2050年に CO2 をゼロにしようとしてるんですけど、そうするとこの右側の絵になるんですが、でもこれで一体何の意味があるのかと、その世界全体で見ると圧倒的にですね、この途上国側の方が排出量が多いし、しかも伸びていくわけですね。なんで先進国だけがゼロにしてもあまり世界の CO2 は減ることになりませんと。だからといって途上国もですね CO2 減らすっていうのは、それは経済開発がうまくいかないところでそういうことをやるっていうことになるのは良くないかもしれない。そんな話です。以上が私のですねごく駆け足の説明でして、でこれからぜひですねルーのですね英語によるプレゼンテーションと、それからあと私との Q&A、どうぞご覧ください。
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucian Pugliaresi. I'm the president of the Energy Policy Research Foundation, and I want to say special thanks to Taishi Sugiyama from the Cannon Institute for Global Studies for inviting me to present and discuss some of the recent developments in energy policy in the United States, particularly the central theme of what the Trump administration is attempting to do. And so I have a brief presentation I'm going to go through, and then we're going to discuss it in more detail. I might just say that I have a very long relationship with Japan. I've been going to Japan for well over 30 years. I have many friends there, and I'm always quite happy to meet and discuss these issues with my Japanese colleagues. So I think the first thing we should talk about is, what is the Trump administration really trying to do? And I think these 9 elements, although there's a lot more going on than this, but this really summarizes how the Trump administration sees the United States, its role in the world, and the importance of domestic energy supplies and also exports. So the first one, advance energy addition, not subtraction. They are very much against these initiatives of the previous administration that sought to halt oil and gas development, so-called legacy fuels, before we had cost-effective substitutes. So this particular policy is coming to an end. The other main feature of the administration is to unleash American energy innovation. They are not necessarily against intermittent sources like wind and solar, although the president himself finds offshore wind to be very uneconomic and difficult to manage. But he wants innovation across the board. So he's happy to see innovation in oil and gas, and probably even coal, although they haven't talked much about this. The next thing is to return to regular order on LNG exports. The president does not see LNG exports as a problem for pricing in the United States or for the United States function of the U.S. economy. In fact, it's his belief that we have plenty of gas for the United States to use and to provide LNG exports to our friends and allies. The other question is promote affordability and consumer choice in home appliances. There's been a lot of attempted applications in the last administration to tell consumers they can only buy a certain kind of car or a certain kind of dishwasher. He's completely against that. 5, he wants to refill the strategic petroleum reserve, which is we have reserves as do our Japanese colleagues. Modernize our nuclear stockpile. So part of that is for the weapons program, and part of it also to begin to buy nuclear fuel. We want to unleash commercial nuclear power in the United States. That's actually an objective of many previous administrations. It's a very difficult problem to solve, but I think they're working on some interesting issues. Strengthen grid reliability and security. One of the things that has emerged in the recent years is that as we've tried to manage more intermittent power, because wind, solar, batteries, these are intermittent sources of power, that we underestimated how difficult and costly it is to manage these kinds of sources and integrate them into the grid. And in fact, you see we have a higher risk of blackouts coming, and this is going to be a big issue in the coming years. And then finally, streamline permitting on American energy. It takes much too long to get the permit to build a new pipeline or to build a new transmission line or to develop offshore leasing. In fact, the existing legislative program in the Congress now is going to mandate more accelerated permitting on American energy. So the program as a whole seeks to really lift up and sustain very large increases in American energy, both for domestic uses and for exports. This is just some basic information, but I think it's important for us to take a look at what's happening, because it is our own research shows that while there's been a lot of investment in renewable fuels or so-called carbon-free fuels, it is not having a very big effect when we look at worldwide data. And you can see here from this chart that if you look at annual CO2 emissions by region, they continue to grow. And the biggest regional locations for growth in emissions is China, India, and the rest of Asia. I think we don't really quite appreciate the important role American oil and gas, but in this particular chart, oil plays in the world. If you take a look at the period of time from 2010 to 2023 and say, okay, let's look at what happened to incremental demand. So we start here in 2011, we say, here's what happened to the growth in demand and who fulfilled that demand. And you can see here that between 2011 and 2023, over 82% of the worldwide growth in demand was provided by the United States. So this is kind of where Trump gets his idea of American dominance. It is this massive increase in the shale gas and oil revolution, the use of hydraulic fracturing, new technologies to extract oil and gas from the United States that has helped to keep the price of oil lower than it would have been. Because in the absence of this big surge of production from the United States, the prices of oil, of course, they went up after the Russians invaded Ukraine, but they came down by 2023. And this situation would have been much more serious, not just for the US, but for the entire world. The other point is that the United States is a massive producer of natural gas. And natural gas is very often a very cost-effective substitute for coal. It can reduce carbon emissions. And if you look at the United States, I'll show you a slide later on that, you can see that much of the reduction in carbon emissions in the United States is not the result of wind and solar and battery cars, but the substitute of US natural gas for coal. So you can see here the US far outproduces Russia and then all the other countries in the world. We produce 26% of the world's supply. Here's the other thing. You see a lot of reports, lots and lots of reports about how renewables are taking over and the zero carbon technologies are dominating. But we need to look at the data very carefully. And you can see that if you look at fossil fuels share of electric power generation worldwide from 1993 to 2023, you see that in 1993, it had 62%. After 30 years, much of it trying to develop more expansive introduction of renewable fuels, it's still 60%. And, a lot of a big portion of the non-emitting carbon technologies are hydroelectric power and nuclear power, technologies that would have been with us for many, many years. The other interesting thing that we like to talk a lot about, I think it's a kind of modern tragedy, is that Africa, Southeast Asia, have found themselves in a position when they get international development assistance to not have access to fossil fuels. And you can see here that in parts of Africa, the amount of the population that has access to regular electricity still is quite low. And this energy poverty in Africa reinforces both high mortality and disease. In fact, 600 million people who live in sub-Saharan Africa use less electricity than 8 million people in New York. New York is relatively rich because it has electricity. It doesn't have electricity because it's rich. And for Africa to grow, it's going to need base, dense, and large volumes of electricity. And to me, this is a kind of terrible tragedy of the developing world. We should have promoted for Africa dense power that can help them develop. You can see here that this is a chart, in my view, this is one of our more interesting charts. It's from the UN and the IEA, and it shows a graph. And the graph is a kind of estimate of something we call the Human Development Index. And in the Human Development Index, it's kind of a calculation of when mankind reaches a certain level of wealth and comfort. And it's not a very high level, Russia, but you can see that in all the world that's above the red line, which would be a human development index of 0.8 or higher, an index that is, has a lot of characteristics of modern society, that these countries use on average the equivalent of 3.6 gallons of oil equivalent. They may get it in different forms, maybe natural gas, it could even be solar or wind. And that all these countries, South Sudan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, China, with large populations, some of them with very high growth rates, they want to be above 0.8. They want to raise their level of standard, and they can only do that with greater access to energy. Now, one of the things I just want to talk about briefly is that you hear a lot of reports from television about, oh, we are seeing unusual amounts of fires and floods because of climate. But in fact, what's really happening is something much different. Yes, we do see these pictures on TV, and this is for the United States. But you can see here, the incidence of floods have not increased since 1940, and the incidence of fires have not increased. Yes, it's true that we've had a lot of damage from fires and floods, but that's just because we've become richer, people have bought more expensive houses, and they have built them in areas where there are floods and fires. But the actual incidence of floods and fires have not increased in the United States. The other interesting issue, and by the way, talking to some Japanese utilities last month, I was quite surprised to hear that in Japan, there is now a surge in electricity demand that the major utilities, Tokyo Electric Power, Chudin, and others are starting to look at. And this is quite a dilemma, because even in Japan, interest in electrification for manufacturing, data centers is growing. And you can see this is a forecast for the United States. And from about 2000 to 2020, we had very flat or slightly growing electricity demand. But now, with the demand for greater use of manufacturing, greater interest in building data centers, we have a big surge in electricity demand, and we're going to have trouble meeting this demand. In Japan, really, this problem can only be solved by starting to deploy a lot of the nuclear power, which is still on the sidelines. And this is a difficult policy issue for Japan. This is a very interesting, this shows the sale of commercial sector electricity between 2013 and 2023 in the United States. And you see the big surge of plus 26, that's Virginia. And they had a big surge because that was really the initial home of the data centers. And all the fiber optic cables went through there, so people wanted to build their data centers there. And in Texas, you have a big growth in population, manufacturing, and the electrification of oil production, rigs and things. Now, going forward, I would say Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, they're willing to give up not being so close to the fastest optic cables and to go where the energy is. And they've had a lot of trouble trying to integrate into grids. So now the trend is they are moving to Texas and Louisiana, where there's lots of energy, and they're getting major oil companies and other folks to build power systems just like 1930 industrial facilities. They will not be connected to the grid. They can provide very reliable power with a combination of sophisticated gas turbines and some batteries. Now, if you don't think that data centers, internet, cryptocurrency isn't a big deal, take a look here. You take the top electricity consumers in the world in 2022, and you start with China, the US, India, Russia, and Japan. Actually, energy consumption for data center transmissions and crypto mining is equivalent to the 6th largest country in the world in terms of electricity consumption. So if we are going to get the benefits of AI, the health benefits, the productivity benefits, all the promises of AI, we are going to have to be able to deliver lots of dense, reliable power for these systems. And it's quite interesting. In the US, I would say the major high-tech companies, which were quite active in promoting green alternatives, many of them which were not that cost effective, are now adjusting their targets to find natural gas and looking for other solutions there. So the data centers, I believe, are starting to take over as a priority over green energy or net zero. Now, it's very important to understand this, what we call the scale challenge, because you hear a lot of discussion about, well, Germany put this much solar power into play. Or they built this many solar power facilities or solar factories or solar rooftop solar. But there's a difference between installing solar generating capacity and actually getting the power out of these units. And what I want you to see in this chart is you can see that the International Energy Agency has an outlook to 2050, right? And their outlook has, in terms of worldwide, if you go from 2001 to 2024, they changed their forecast and increased the amount of electricity they believe the world will need in 2050 by 11,650 terawatt hours. So that's the increase in their forecast in just 3 years. If you look at the lower right-hand corner, right, this little green bar here, you can see here that that is the total amount of generating capacity for solar photovoltaic and wind in 2023. So just the increase from 2021 to 2024, more than 3 times the amount of total solar and PV we generated in 2023. The other question is, we talk about intermittent power, and I want you to watch this little animation here. This shows you something called the duck curve. So the yellow is the solar power, you can see, and these are the days, selected days in each year when the net load was quite low. And you can see here what's happening. As they, push more intermittent power like solar and wind into the system, the recovery when the sun goes down becomes very, very steep. And this is extremely expensive to manage. And I think that, it's quite amazing to me that many utility managers, refuse to really document this, implement this, and warn policymakers about it. And this is one of the reasons why California, and Casio is the California regulator, has much higher electricity prices than Florida, for example. Now, the other question is, why is this largely net zero, largely a developing world problem? It might be our problem in a way that we've been emitting CO2 for many years. But it's very important to understand at the margin where you should put your effort. And you can see here, if you take what we call the Energy Information Reference Case, the amount of forecasted carbon emissions in 2050 is 42.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, right? From about 34 gigatons today. However, even if the entire OECD would go to net zero, we would still emit into 2050 30 million gigatons. In other words, unless the non-OECD went along with a net zero program, we would still be emitting a somewhat less, maybe 10% than we're emitting now. So you have to ask yourself another question. Does it make sense for the developing world to spend vast amounts of the funds that could improve the livelihoods of their own people, or even help the developing world, for a relatively modest, or let's say incomplete, reduction to net zero? And this is the problem, because the rich countries can afford to try some of this, although they're getting tired of it. Indonesia has abandoned net zero. The Tory party in Britain has now announced they're abandoning net zero. So I think, we're going to need a new pathway going forward. But if any of your listeners would like more information, please, you can note my email in the show notes and let them know we're most happy to respond to them. And they can find access to all our studies and research on our website at eprinc.org. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Lou, very much for the very clear presentation with nice slides and animation. And so let me ask a couple of questions now. The first one is that the Japanese mainstream media tends to say that Mr. Trump is a so strange person that he denies the climate change. But it seems that almost all Republicans share the view of the Mr. Trump with regard to climate change. They would never say that it's a scam, but they don't think that there is a climate crisis at all, and the climate is the utmost priority.
So yeah, let's talk about this. Is a really good question because, in the history of kind of environmental challenges, and we've had a lot of them over the years, and actually the Western societies, Japan and all the societies, I consider Japan a Western country in terms of its enlightenment. We have addressed environmental problems through regulatory programs that try to look at some trade-off of costs and benefits. In other words, we try to reach certain standards. But the notion of net zero is so bizarre because it doesn't include any discussion, okay, what strategies are most cost-effective? How should we think about this problem long-term? What is the trade-off from human development and climate? And more important, how should we think about both the question of mitigation and adaptation? I'll give you a story about this, why Trump thinks this is a scam, I believe. Take the island of Hawaii, right? The island of Hawaii has a very aggressive net zero program, and it's spiking electricity prices. But does anyone believe that anything the Hawaiian Islands do in terms of reducing carbon emissions will have any effect on world climate? Absolutely not. It's too small. So the rational strategy for the Hawaiian Islands should have been, okay, let's try to estimate what the risks of climate are. Maybe we need to strengthen some of our road networks. Maybe we need to think about seawalls or some ways to adjust to rising seas, if that's the problem, or even temperature, the way we build buildings and everything. This would be a rational approach for a small island community. And so somehow we got lost in terms of public policy. We focused on net zero. And when the cost of net zero gets quite steep, the farther you go on this, instead of saying, okay, let's have a balanced approach. And we also think about, and I think this is where the IEA is in serious trouble. The IEA continued to promote this idea that we should halt oil and gas production, but we did not have a substitute for oil and gas production. They thought that somehow the substitute would be magical, some combination of hydrogen or EVs and stuff. These are just not being deployed at a rate that's going to make a big difference. So I think we have to figure, how do we get the public to put this whole problem in some kind of reasonable context? Because this is not the most serious problem facing the world.
Well, so you think that this sort of rational thinking is well taken by the Republican people in America?
I think they have a much more rational approach. Of course, when it gets displayed in American politics, it can seem quite strange or extreme, but that's not what. I think it's a more realistic view, and they're hearing this from their constituents. Their constituents don't like high gasoline prices, and they don't like blackouts, okay? If we start, and we have a big problem in the power sector in the United States. If we start losing power in some parts of the country, and that's very likely in the next few years, there are going to be a lot of unhappy customers, and they're going to look for some politician to blame.
Okay. And the next question is about the stability. I would say that also, again, the Japanese mainstream media tends to think the current American energy policy as just a temporary deviation from the long-term trend of toward net zero. That's the terminology they want to use. That they tend to argue that overall trends to decarbonization will never change. But is it a temporal deviation or not?
Of course, it's I'm not a really great predictor of social trends, but I would say that if you look around the world, first, if you go to the developing world, for example, Africa, they'll tell the lending countries whatever they want to hear. So, but if you go meet with these senior policymakers, say in Africa, they all know they need lots of dense power because that's the only way they can industrialize and lift the welfare of the population. You go to a country like Indonesia. There are 290 million people in Indonesia. Everybody wants an air conditioner. It's hot.
Yeah.
You think you can raise the price of electricity without having a political upheaval? Absolutely not. Lots of the the South Asian countries, they show up at COP, whatever, and give it lip service, but they're not willing to undertake the high costs it takes to go to net zero. Not only that, many of these countries are having trouble just moving from coal to gas, right? So I think this is slowly unraveling. I think in Europe, you already see Meloni making the prime minister of Italy. You see the Tory party in Britain has thrown it under the bus. None of the Eastern Europeans really believe in net zero. They're more worried about the Russians and continue to provide economic opportunities for their population. So I think it's fading. I don't know what the pathway is to a better compromise yet. We keep thinking about that a lot, but as an issue, it's fading.
So the overall trend is not toward net zero.
I don't know how Japan alters its course. They have a plan B, but the plan B is still pretty aggressive in my mind. So
yeah, I agree that we don't have a serious plan at this moment. That's my understanding. We must revise it.
It's very interesting to me. What is it that the people of Japan believe this is a very serious issue they should do? What is driving the people of Japan? What do they see in day to day in the weather or the climate that makes them think they need to do this in some kind of...
There has been much propaganda by media and the government, so people believe that there is a climate crisis and we must achieve net zero. At least it is politically correct. So it's very difficult to say something against that. That's a current situation. But as you say that if the energy prices is increasing, then people will not be happy. So there's some limit to the implementation of the net zero policy.
Yeah.
Can I go to the next one?
Absolutely.
Now that Mr. Trump has issued many orders, and there's also legislation coming in your presentation, as you mentioned, but there may be some obstacles against the development of the fossil fuel fields and industries. There are many, America is known for the many lawyers, and you have many environmental regulations at the federal level and other regulations at the state level as well. And is Mr. Trump going to overcome all those obstacles? And can we really have the?
So I think at one level you're quite right. It's hard to revolutionize the whole legal permitting process in the United States overnight. I do think, though, that it's very interesting to me is that the group, a political force in the U.S., which is the high-tech companies, as I said before, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, they are at an interesting position now where they're saying, we can't do this AI if we don't have power. And in some cases, they're doing things that are quite interesting. For example, I believe that Google announced they were building a massive AI facility in Texas. And they said, well, we're going to have, we've contracted with this individual who can do direct air capture at $100 a ton. So they're kind of buying a social contract to proceed because they're doing this, this direct air capture, but nobody believes anyone can collect carbon at $100 a ton. They don't even think they can do it at $400 a ton. So I think they're kind of, pursuing some things that look okay on paper in some cases. In other cases, I do think there are some cases where people can do some underground storage and capture, and with natural gas. But for the U.S. as a whole, if you think about this sort of AI revolution, electricity requirement, this is only going to get solved through two ways, because everyone agrees that we have to do it in the next 3, 4, 5 years if we are going to compete with China and other parts of the world. And you cannot build out hydrogen and these exotic alternatives in the next 3, 4, 5 years. You can't manage the power system with this much intermittent power. So I believe how this is going to play out is that the big data center demand is going to go off the grid, is going to be driven by gas, almost entirely by gas. There'll be some facilities that will be able to do underground storage and capture in a relatively cost-effective way. There'll be some other places where they'll do some other measures, but basically gas is pretty clean. I think that's what they're going to do.
Is the American energy demand, particularly electricity demand, increases and American energy production increases, there will be many business chances to Japanese trade companies and engineering companies. And do you think that they are welcome to invest in America?
Oh yeah, I think they're very welcome to invest in America. I'm thinking maybe the Nippon Steel deal will go through, but I'm not sure. But I see some movement there. Yeah, I know that some big trading companies are very big in the Permian Basin already. I think Tokyo Gas has some big investments. I think Chuba, TEPCO, they're all, you can see them in other parts of the U.S. So many of the Japanese utilities have very big international divisions. So yes, I think it's quite possible.
It's a bit ironic because that the Japanese companies are asked to zero emissions by its own government, but they have business chances in America. But it's good to know that there are certain chances.
But the Japanese people and Japanese government have a long history of pragmatism. I think they're a little bit like the U.S. in the sense that I suspect Japanese policy will alter at some point, particularly if it becomes very expensive and harmful for the Japanese economy.
I agree. Finally, let me ask you another question about the international dimension. So far, in the first month of the Trump administration, the administration has been focused on domestic energy policy pretty much, but they have not talked much about the international energy policy. Perhaps what is important is that now that after the Biden administrations, almost all international financial organization, assistance organization have stopped to finance the fossil fuel projects in developing countries, including Africa. And I think it's very stupid. It has to be changed. At a certain time point, I'm expecting that the American government puts certain pressure on the international organization to resume the financing.
Right. I think this is a great question because partly is that I think the internet, even if the U.S. didn't have enough voting power, I think World Bank, IFC, ADB, Asian Development Bank, International Finance Corporation, even the World Bank, that the U.S. eventually, Trump will get his appointees in those board positions, and U.S. votes will be affected that way. But I also think that, I don't know where the administration is on this. I'm going to CERAWeek next in a couple of weeks. We're gonna have a big Japanese contingent there. We're going to be doing a big event with IEJ and MEDI on LNG. So I do think there is an opportunity here to look at, and this will appeal to Trump in my mind. He will look at Southeast Asia, say, and Africa and say, well, why don't we help them with fossil energy? If they want that, why don't we help them? Because Trump is an interesting politician in the sense he doesn't care what other people think. He has his own views. I mean, I think he's wrong in a lot of these tariff ideas, that they're not going to be very helpful, but he's likely to, I was at an event in the Philippines where a Danish parliamentarian said, look, you should treat Trump seriously, but not literally. And I do think these ideas will will eventually, and I suspect as State Department gets up and running and the DOE gets up and running, you're going to see some international initiatives that are going to be very interesting.
I wish Japan can also work with the America to change the international organizations, and there are many reasons for Southeast Asian countries to have liquefied natural gas and even coal. I think there's some less developed countries need coal development as well.
That's true.
So, okay, thank you very much, Lou, for your presence, and we've learned a lot. And goodbye now.
And Taishi, we look forward to welcoming you here in Washington. Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.